Also talk about the whole notion that Vic Taves addressed yesterday about the concern about the radicalization of particularly young members of the Muslim community, and the whole question of that word would become very much a buzzword, radicalization. And my next guest is going to address that directly. Syed Ahmed Amir, who's with the Islamic Supreme Council of Canada. He is an imam and an activist working against radicalization. He's doing so with a 12-step program with which he's having considerable success. But the whole issue is our topic for discussion. Thanks for coming in on it. Where does radicalization begin?
Radicalization is, there is no beginning to it. Radicalization is actually a process that individuals in the community, youth born and raised in this part of the world, and youth from around the world fall prey to and become susceptible to. It's a process, and it's really, as per the studies of experts, it's a four-stage process. There's a pre-radicalization stage, there is a self-identification stage, there's an indoctrination stage, and there is a jihadization stage, which is essentially the PhD in radicalization. Individuals that successfully complete 4 of these stages will be most probable and most likely to go and try to conspire to commit some act of terrorism against their countries.
Who's particularly vulnerable then to that?
Well, essentially, the pre-radicalization stage involves just anybody that most individuals would least likely suspect to be a radical or radicalized in the process. These are individuals that have little or very small amounts of exposure to the traditional doctrines and teachings of the Islamic faith, and have had really no exposure to traditional Islamic interpretation. So these individuals are usually motivated by some sort of a crisis, which is usually a catalyst in them turning their lives around and trying to become more spiritual or more devout. At this stage, what happens is that these individuals begin to explore one particular interpretation of the Islamic faith, which, according to, for example, the NYPD, is referred to as Wahhabism or Salafism. Okay. And that one particular ideology, while it does not directly preach jihad against non-Muslims or against Muslims for that matter, it is actually, as per our agencies and our intelligence findings, is conducive to the radicalization process.
So is it something within, either they've heard from teachings or picked up literature on the street, or are moved by events and things happening in the world that then moves it one step along?
I would say it's actually all of those things put together. It's usually events that are happening in the world or even in their home countries that motivate them to want to really do something in response. What happens is that individuals that go down this path of radicalization, they are exposed to one particular interpretation which legitimizes an armed response to what they seem to be, what they see to be grievances around the Muslim world.
Okay. So you step in. You see this. You've seen this because in your own community, you dealt with some of those who were involved in the Toronto 18. Yes. Can you see the process in the young men?
You can actually, because each of these 4 stages actually has their own specific signatures. And so what happens is that, mind you, all of these 4 stages are interdependent of each other. It's not necessary that a person goes through 2 or 3 of these stages and actually ends up committing an act of terror or conspires to commit an act of terror. But somebody that completes the 3rd stage and graduates onto the 4th stage, those are usually your suspects, and these are the individuals that go in there. So what I teach and what we export to different mosques throughout the country, and now even in the Middle East, my program is picking up in countries such as Saudi Arabia, is to look out for these signatures. Such as the abandoning of traditional interpretation of the Islamic faith, like reference to expert interpretation. Another hallmark of these individuals is that they reject all other interpretations of Islam. For example, the biggest problem that we face in the de-radicalization process is the effort to delegitimize this ideology. Our experts have found that this ideology is very much so conducive to the radicalization process, but the biggest problem that we're faced with here, even though we have Canadian imams giving 600-page fatwas against terrorism, saying that the terrorists are calling towards hell, not the Islamic understanding of heaven, is that we are up against a monopoly on Islam in the heart of Islam. So a Canadian imam issuing a fatwa, how much does that really stand in front of Muslims and different congregations in Canada when you have this interpretation, which does not actually call to violence, but its methodology of interpretation of Islamic texts is conducive to the radicalization process.
Okay. So much we could talk more about that, but I'm going to leave it at that. A fascinating understanding of this, much more so, and thank you so much for
You're
being
very
here.
welcome.